Hello everybody, it's me Julian, and today I'd like to provide you with a simple and accessible introduction to what is arguably one of Karl Marx's most interesting and important ideas, namely Entfremdung, or alienation. And Marx's basic argument, to simplify somewhat, is that life under capitalism becomes alienated from itself, that we lose touch with the things that make life worth living. But Marx is also making a slightly more complicated philosophical argument. And what I'd like to do here is to provide you with the basic analysis that underpins Marx's position. But let's start with a seemingly simple idea that Marx has that I think is often, that people often fail to appreciate. Marx says that there are essentially two types of alienation. There's the alienation of the rich, and there's the alienation of the poor. And Marx says that the alienation of the rich is actually quite fun, quite pleasurable, i.e., it's fun to be alienated if you have enough money to do so. Think about Jeff Bezos, who travels around the world on a jet, hopping from yacht to yacht, going to sporting events and festivals and God knows what, essentially living a completely alienated life, detached from humanity, detached from the ordinary man. And yet, to some extent, one imagines that he enjoys this, that it is pleasurable in some sense. And Marx's basic argument is that the alienation of the rich is facilitated by the alienation of the poor, which is to say the worker who has to go to the Amazon distribution plant where he packages consumer goods for other people and sends it off, clocking in the morning and clocking out late at night. In other words, the worker is free, but free only to the extent that he is willing to sell his labor for the surplus profit of Jeff Bezos. Therefore, Jeff Bezos's happy alienation is facilitated by the unhappy alienation of the common man, of the worker. In fact, Marx's basic argument is that capitalism allows us to be free, but as I said before, only to the extent that we make ourselves unfree. Which is to say, the innovation of capitalism is that we exploit ourselves, or we allow ourselves willingly to be exploited, working jobs we don't want to work, living in a way that we don't find to be agreeable. And we have to. There is no safety net. It can be very difficult to find alternatives. In fact, the alternative that is provided to most people is to say, you too could be like the capitalist. You too could be a winner instead of a loser. And this drives massive social stratification, but above all, it perpetuates wealth inequality. Either you are one of the exploited, or you are one of the ones doing the exploitation. And Marx's basic argument that I think is really important is that he says capitalism and the exchange of goods or commodities by means of money is supposed to liberate us from feudalism, which say in a feudal society, we have the lord and the bondsman. We have the master and the slave, as it were. And if you're born a bondsman, you will always be a bondsman. And if you're born a lord, you will always remain a lord. And for Marx, money and the emergence of capitalism is supposed to liberate us from feudalism, i.e., it doesn't matter who you are when you are born. As long as you can pay for something, you can acquire the commodity. Like, if you show up and try to buy a Bugatti, it doesn't matter if you were born rich or if you made your money by means of painstaking labor. This means that it's supposed to be a more equal society, a society in which, as long as you have the money to back it up, you too can be free. You too can be gainfully alienated, as it were. And yet Marx says the problem is that capitalism isn't truly a meritocracy. It's not truly free. Instead, and this is really the key part of Marx's argument, instead what happens is that the central dynamic, the logic of feudalism, master-slave, lord-bondsman, becomes reified within capitalism, except now it is disavowed, which is to say, capitalism still functions according to the logic of the master and the slave, the lord and the bondsman, the rich and the poor, but now it appears to the poor person that he himself is his own master, that he himself could be rich someday. In fact, in the United States, when you ask people whether or not they think they're poor, many of them will say, I'm not poor, I'm simply on my way to becoming rich. And you can't blame them for saying this, because why classify yourself as poor in a society in which poverty is absolutely criminalized? This fits with the ideological narrative that you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you should make something out of yourself, and that if you fail to do so, it is on your own head. That if we provide people with basic social services or safety nets, we are essentially rewarding them for lazy behavior, or we're giving them charity that encourages them to be lazy, etc. Of course, this is the language of the Lord, of the master, essentially whipping the slaves. And yet within capitalism, the logic of the Lord and the bondsman, the master and the slave, becomes reified and disavowed or repressed under the auspices of a free and equal participation. But of course, nobody actually believes in said free and equal participation, which means that we know very well that it's not an equitable system. And yet, nevertheless, we must sell our labor, because otherwise we can't exist as a citizen subject. We can't put food on the table, we can't pay for rent, etc. Now, of course, we could do a whole video on how this relates to credit and debt and loans and rent, etc. But let's put that aside for a moment, and let's focus on the philosophical influences that underpin Marx's theory of alienation, which are twofold. On the one hand, Hegel, and on the other, Feuerbach. Hegel's idea of spirit and Feuerbach's idea or critique of religion. And I've explained Hegel's position on spirit before in a video titled Hegel's Most Important Idea, but Hegel essentially believed that as we exist in the world, we're all alienated. We're detached from the essence of what it means to be alive. And for Hegel, this had less to do with being connected to your family and your society and eating nice food, etc. For Hegel, it was a philosophical argument that unless we all became philosophers, we were alienated from essence. We were alienated from the true. Therefore, to achieve a higher understanding of what he called spirit and its functioning was how spirit knew itself. Therefore, the ultimate goal of philosophy, like history, was for spirit to know itself through us, therefore achieving a higher consciousness, which he equated with overcoming alienation. So for Hegel, he's quite pessimistic. To simply exist is to be alienated. And Hegel has subjective and objective alienation, but I can cover that in another video. Feuerbach's critique of religion argues that if you believe in God, you are alienated. In fact, Feuerbach has this idea of a God who needs human beings to worship him, otherwise he can't be considered God. Therefore, to worship God is to become alienated from the world around you and to believe in a higher deity. It's a critique of religion of sorts. In fact, Marx simply extrapolates from this a more ideological position, which is to say that the worker worships the master as if he were a god, that he himself wants to be like the master, therefore losing touch with his surroundings. Like, think about videos that say The Secrets of the Rich, or how you too can read books like Jeff Bezos, or how you can work out like Bill Gates, etc. Like, these types of attitudes mirror within capitalism the central process of alienation that Feuerbach articulates when it comes to people wanting to worship God or be like Christ, etc. Therefore, Marx essentially takes the Hegelian idea of alienation and how alienation is to be overcome by means of pure knowing or pure reason. And he applies this to the idea of the revolution, that the revolution is the moment in which the worker becomes aware of his own alienation, therefore, in a sense, having already overcome it. The idea that all you have to lose are your own chains is actually to be taken quite literally here. It's not that you sever yourself from the chains by means of having more equitable pay. You sever yourself from the chains by means of realizing that you are a necessary cog in this exploitative machine. And the Feuerbachian position, therefore, is that these gods are false gods. They're false idols. They need, in the same way that for Feuerbach, God needs people to worship him so that he might be God, the capitalist needs the worker who willingly exploits himself on behalf of the capitalist surplus profit in order to be the master. And I'd like to conclude here briefly with an argument that Marx makes about alienation in general, because it can seem a little bit depressing to simply talk about alienation in terms of like how, workers supposedly become alienated from life, etc. But I think the basic point to be made here, and I want to stress this, is that alienation for Hegel and for Marx is in some sense necessary, which is to say, it's not simply about overcoming alienation. I think this is quite an important distinction. If you're simply trying to overcome alienation, you could just as well go to YouTube and say 10 ways to sleep better, 10 ways to be less depressed, 10 ways to be more productive and a happier person. Marx's point isn't that alienation is because we're unhappy as workers, because we can't match our own expectations, we're not productive, etc. Marx's point is that the very necessity of presenting as happy, presenting as successful, of being a good, hardworking individual who is working their way up in the world is this very alienation. That as long as we consider the world seen through a lens of capital, we are alienated from what makes life essentially worth living. This means that the point isn't to overcome alienation so as to be a better, more hardworking, less depressed worker. It's to make ourselves less alienated by means precisely of realizing how alienation is, in its most extreme form, pleasant. Which is to say, we're back at the alienation of the capitalist. The capitalist is pleasurably, gainfully alienated. And for Marx, this is perhaps the true alienation. When we think that we have won, when we think that we are on top of the world, when we think that everything is perfect, this is the most dangerous type of alienation, the kind of alienation where we become the perpetrators of other people's ungainful alienation. Therefore, the point of alienation isn't that we should become less alienated, but go through alienation. Marx, like Hegel, believed that alienation was a necessary step towards the subject's self-recognition. Therefore, in a sense, let's say that you're a poor worker and you're trying to become rich. One day you become rich and you realize you're still not happy. You're still not fulfilled. In other words, you've gone through the process of low alienation, which promised a release once you achieved high or fun alienation. And realizing that the fun alienation is itself empty is the moment of truth. The moment in which you realize that you have to sever your own chains. Not the chains of poverty, but the chains of what you believe makes you happy. Which is to say, at this point, you realize that even making money doesn't make you happy. And of course, today we have those popular memes that say something like, it's money doesn't make you happy, but it's better to cry in a Porsche than it is to cry in public transit, etc. But the point is that if even success makes you unhappy, if even wealth makes you alienated, if even living the dream makes you feel like you're unhappy, then the dream is not enough. Then the dream is a false one. Therefore, the dream presents itself, like for Feuerbach, as a false idol, as a false god, a dream that requires us to dream it. And once we've understood that capitalism is a false dream that we all have to dream in, but the capitalist is the one who doesn't have to dream in it, i.e. he's already liberated himself from the exploitative mechanism, but by means of exploiting others, we can liberate ourselves from this dream, which is in fact a nightmare. Alienation is therefore not strictly speaking something to be overcome, it is something to be experienced. It teaches us something. There is a truth to alienation about the structural components of capitalism and how they allow us to imagine a humanity seen only through the lens of capital. That is Marx's concept of alienation, or Entfremdung, and its philosophical origins. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to learn more about these ideas, please do hop over to Patreon, where you can download my lectures as well as my ebooks. I'll see you soon.